Okay, so real quick, because I really wasn't planning on making a video today, and so I want to try to stay on task today. But I felt I needed to kind of almost vent, and this is one of the reasons why I created this channel, is to give myself a platform or a tool or an instrument to use to be able to process the things that I might be going through. And today, I had it in my heart that I was going to go and spend some time with my grandmother today. For those of you who don't know, I do have a 94-year-old grandmother who I basically was raised in the house with her, and so it's more so of the second mother that I have. I think we put her in a nursing home, and it may have been June or so, something like that. And but she had a seizure that caused her to fall on her bottom when she was having the seizure. When she fell on her bottom, she was no longer mobile, so she was no longer walking, although her legs and her arms, she's able to move them, but for whatever reason she stopped feeding herself. She still is in her right mind, and what I mean by in her right mind is that she's still able to recognize people, and she's still able to answer questions with a yes or a no, engage in some conversation to some degree. But for the most part, it's really difficult for me to have a conversation with my grandma. But it used to be where she would ask you, what have you been up to that day, or ask you something, but you know, she's kind of stopped doing that. So anytime I go and visit her, I really feel like the visit is just insignificant. And you know, the environment has changed, and so you know, I'm a private person, and so to try to kind of visit with my grandmother, and she's got a roommate in there who is almost policing your visit, it really just makes, you know, the whole situation quite complicated. And so today I just found myself being extremely frustrated, almost, you know, being brought to tears as to how to handle this situation. You know, I don't want her to ever feel like, you know, I've given up on her or that I've abandoned her. And I just really don't know what to do. And so, but the nature of the relationship that I have with my grandmother, as she started getting older, her words started becoming fewer and far between. And I remember when I used to find myself almost frustrated with her when I was going through life and just kind of seeking answers or seeking counsel. And she really wouldn't have much to offer rather than, you know, God knows. I'm reminded of a time where I just came back to town, and I decided that I was going to plant some tomatoes. That's something that my grandmother and I used to do a lot when I was a kid, which was gardening. She used to always garden. A lot of the stuff I didn't retain, but you know, being in the garden is almost nostalgic to me because it was just something that I used to do growing up. And so she was at an age where she was no longer able to really get out there and, you know, bend over and till the ground and do all of those different things. And so I decided that I was going to at least just plant some tomatoes that summer. And this was the first time that I was kind of taking on that task without any supervision, so to speak. And I remember planting the tomatoes and, you know, and watering them, and 1 week goes by and it seems as if nothing has changed, and another week, and I will go into the house and I'd say, Grandma, you know, the tomatoes aren't doing anything. I don't see anything on the vines. You know, what's going on? What am I doing wrong? Do you have any pointers? And she would chuckle and say, oh, girl, you know. And so I'm thinking, like, I'm serious. Do you have any pointers? You know, but she would never really offer any pointers. And so that would cause me to almost be frustrated with my grandmother. And as the summer progressed, I actually ended up leaving town. And so and my mom ended up taking on the process of watering the tomatoes and so on and so forth. And they called me out of town and they said, yeah, your tomato vines, we've got some tomatoes on the vine now, you know. And I remember my grandmother during that time, she would always just say, God knows, you know. And so what I took away from that, and what was a lesson that God has taught me through the very minimum words that my grandmother would offer, is that sometimes things look like, sometimes it seems like what you are doing is not effective. It seems like, you know, you go out there and you water and you plant, and it just seems like it's not effective. And so but God knows, and it's God that brings the increase. And although we have done everything that we can do in our strength and everything that we know to do, it is still God who brings the increase. And so I wasn't expecting to get this worked up in this video, but it was something that I felt like I needed to get off of my chest, because sometimes, many times, we get weary and well doing, and we feel like what we are doing is not significant. And we don't see the fruit of our labor. And not only do we not see the fruit of our labor, it doesn't look like anything is happening. And during those times, you just have to keep doing what you know to do. And if you keep doing what you know to do, everything will work out, you know. And so that's one of the most important lessons that I've learned from my grandmother. And she didn't say anything other than God knows. But over time, I understood what that meant. Over time, as the tomatoes began to come forth on the vine, I understood what that meant. Okay, so I had to come back because my camera got a little too hot, and it said that I was getting a little too worked up. And so it gave me a chance to kind of gather myself and come back. And I can't guarantee that I won't get worked up again. And it's simply because when you see the tears, it doesn't have anything to do with being frustrated with work, being frustrated with anything. It's just, you know, for me personally, it's being frustrated with the fact that when I show up, you know, out there to visit my grandmother, it just seems like it's just not significant. And so, but I know that someone else who may be viewing this video can take what I'm going through today and apply it to whatever it is that you feel that you have been pouring yourself into, and you don't see any result from it. And I just take this time to just encourage you and remind you that God knows. And hopefully I don't frustrate you as much as I have found myself being frustrated when my grandmother was telling me that. But I think a lot of times, and I'm just going to take this brief moment to touch on it. You know, I'm trying not to turn this into a Bible study, but I think a lot of times the Bible talks about seed time and harvest time, really for us to get an understanding of what it means to go through a process, that sometimes things don't happen overnight. And I think even when I was, planting those tomatoes, I think I had never gardened by myself before. I had never gardened without my grandmother being there. And so sometimes, like, even when we're going through life and we trying to, start our relationship with God, or we're trying to seek God as to, okay, which direction should I go? How should I do it? And we pray, and then we feel like we don't hear anything. It almost feels like you're gardening by yourself at this point, that you kind of, sometimes you second guess what it is that you're doing and whether or not what you're doing is effective or not. Sometimes it just seems like you question even whether or not God hears your prayers, but I think when it comes to, for individuals who may not necessarily have faith at the center of everything that they do. Sometimes you may not feel the significance of spirituality or acknowledging God, because you feel like you can just do things in your own willpower, just put some elbow grease to it and get the job done. However, when you deal with something of nature, far as planting seeds and something growing from it, or when a woman conceives a child and the child has to go through a gestational period before the child is birthed, at that point, that is something that is beyond our control. No matter how much elbow grease we want to put forth through it, no matter how hard we try to work it, we cannot rush that process. The process is what it is, and so sometimes we can get weary when we are trying to make something happen that is not going to happen until God says it's time for it to happen. I don't even know why I went that direction, but I think a lot of times we show up and we are doing the right things. However, we are expecting results quicker than what they're going to come. But it doesn't mean that they're not going to come. It just means that you have to embrace the process of those results evolving and manifesting in your life. That's just a nugget for anybody who's willing to catch it and receive it. But going back to, the reason why I even felt led to turn on this camera today is just because I just needed to get that off of my chest, and I think that's what God's answer was to me today when I found myself, just so overwhelmed with frustration and a sense of not being able to control what's happening. Is that just because you don't see any results does not mean that it wasn't significant. Just because when I went to visit my grandmother today, she wouldn't even really wake up from her nap, it doesn't mean that it wasn't significant, but sometimes we take it on as such. For me, that it was just a lesson. It's a lesson that I'm still learning, because I prayed about this, even recently, as to, how help me through this season. How can I be there for my grandmother when she doesn't like to watch TV. She doesn't read books. She doesn't do anything. What can I do? So now I'm in a season where the things that I say and the things that I do, meaning the gifts that I bring, those things are no longer effective when I'm trying to love my grandmother anymore. And so now, through the relationship that I have with my grandmother, God is challenging me to operate in love on a different frequency, because so often we love when we see that the love that we are giving is being received, or we see that, when we give a gift and someone responds with gratitude, we feel that our act of giving was significant, which encourages us to continue to give. But what happens when we give a gift and it doesn't seem as if that gift was received well, or if it was even acknowledged? A lot of times what we'll do is we'll just stop giving in that direction and start, giving in another direction. I hope that makes sense. I hope it makes sense. But what I'm saying is that sometimes when we are doing things, we're doing things with an expectation of how it should turn out, instead of doing things because it's what you should do. Love because it's what you're supposed to do. Love because we are love. Love because it's a liberating feeling to love, rather than to hold grudges, or rather than to withhold something that you have to give. So whether or not it's being there for a loved one, whether or not it's trying to love your companion, whether or not it's learning how to love your vocation, I think that when we find ourselves weary and well-doing, we have to sometimes reassess our expectations and adjust our expectations. Hope that makes sense. But Anyway, I'm glad I got this off my chest. I'm glad that you all stuck around to listen. And I just encourage you all to keep going forward, keep loving forward, keep growing through it, keep becoming better because of your trials and your tribulations. Don't allow these situations to make you feel, to become apathetic, to become indifferent, to become bitter or frustrated. Allow God to process you in the process. And so that's pretty much what I've been going through today. And find some way to, I've been just trying to find some way to keep myself uplifted and encouraged during this time, because I know that God knows. Until next time.
Everything that I thought I lost was everything that I had to gain. Now I think I'm in love again. Now I know I'm in love again. Wasn't perfect, but I tried my best. I lost a lot, but I passed the test. And grace and mercy found me again. Now I'm able to breathe.